Thank you, and it's great to be here. It's great to see you here. Stephanie wants me to explain the science, talk about the Adirondacks, give the climate news, and then give a little framework for how we do something about it and not talk too long. And so I've got a little work to do. All the science is really right there in that picture. The mountains in the distance are fainter, not because they are fainter, but because there's light coming back from the air between us and them. The molecules in the air send light back in all directions to us. Heat is just a form of light. The molecules in the air also send heat back to us. And that is really the greenhouse effect. What molecules in the air? Well, many, but carbon dioxide is the big player. And the big source of carbon dioxide is, of course, fossil fuels. So the science really comes back to the fact that the more carbon dioxide we put in the air, the more heat is sent back down and the less escapes the planet, and the hotter we get. Now, I got to figure out some buttons here. Only take a second. There we go. Where does the carbon dioxide come from? Well, you know the answer. It comes from everything that uses fossil fuel energy, and that faint building there could be anything. It could be a museum, a home, a little cabin in the woods, a school, a town, a whole country. It's just some unit. And we know what the fossil fuels are used for. You know, the obvious ones are transportation, heat, electricity, but there are two other categories there. All the manufactured stuff that is bought and all the food comes in. And of course, some of these are direct and some of them are indirect. When we run the car or when we heat the house, that's pretty direct. The carbon comes out of our exhaust pipes. But when we buy food or when we buy tennis shoes or computers or when I bought all the books I use to write other books, that's how you write books, I think, somebody else is emitting carbon on our behalf, and that's indirect. How much carbon? Well, a great deal of carbon. And this kind of graph, and I've put the hard stuff up front in this lecture, and then it gets pictures and more general. But the hard stuff is important because I'm not going to mince any words. In the climate war that is coming, in the climate world war that is started now and is going to occupy the world for the next century, if there are winners, it's going to be a team with very good arithmetic and number skills, among many other skills. So we need some numbers. So the red line in that graph is carbon dioxide emissions by the world. It's in billions of tons. It's going up. It continues to go up. And so that's the amount you emit every year. And a useful notion is that then to get the total amount emitted, you multiply that by some length of time, and you get something like the average under that. So that says so far human beings have emitted 2 trillion tons. And that leads to several pretty important thoughts. Why do we emit so much carbon? Not all of that's fossil fuel carbon, but most of it is. We emit it because there are a lot of us, you know this, and we use a lot of energy. Well, why do we get the energy from fossil fuels? And there are two reasons. One reason is that fossil fuels are very concentrated. You can get, if I hold up a little glass full of 6 or 8 ounces of fuel oil, the mechanical power from that is like a day's work for a team of horses. Incredibly concentrated, and they come out of little concentrated holes in the ground. And I could enlarge on that in some, but that makes them really absolutely remarkable sort of energy sources. But the other reason we use so much, another reason is there are just a lot of us, and there are more of us every year. It only took, about 13 years to add from 6 billion on the planet to 7 billion on the planet. It may only take 13 years to add another billion. So there are a lot of us. But the third reason is that fossil fuels are relatively very cheap. They're just about the cheapest way you can run a car or run a building or a country. But why are they cheap? And so this is the first idea that I really want to put in your heads. They are cheap only because when we buy them, when I drive my car, I don't pay for the damage that the fossil fuel does. I would argue that the fossil fuel emissions, they kill forests. That's acid rain all over the world. They heat up the planet. They kill reefs. They destroy reef fisheries. People don't have a living. They change the ecology. They change the fire and the beetle ecology of the Pacific Northwest, and millions of acres of timber in Canada are now dying from the bark beetle infestations. They create storms. Those storms kill people. None of that I pay for at the gas tank. So here is the second idea, and we're going to be talking today and this week mostly about local action, but I have to put it in a world context. There, that colored bar over there are the emitters. China is now by 50% even larger than the US, the largest emitter in the world. They're large because they got a lot of billions of people, but they're large also because they make the stuff for the rest of the world. But it is clearly a world problem. And, you know, this is going to cut both ways. It's a complicated thing, but that world problem, number one, will not be solved unless every village, community in the world has some part in the solution. So the kind of action we're talking about today, without that, the world problem doesn't get solved. But the world problem also doesn't get solved unless there is national and world action to basically make fossil fuels more expensive, which is to say make them pay for the damage they do. And that's a very simple requirement. Lots of other things in the world have to pay for the damage they do. Where do we go in the next century? Well, no one knows, but there's a century of time out ahead of us, and just jumping backwards, that was time past, time future. And remember that, you know, somewhere under that curve is the total amount we emit. If nothing happens, you know, if the governments of the world do not do something to make fossil fuels pay for the cost of the damage they do, we're just going to continue to burn it all. And those numbers, the far right, are parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. We're, you know, pushing 300 now. We started off a century or so ago under 200. If we burn it all, and there's plenty to burn, fossil fuels will not run out for a couple of centuries. I don't think oil will run out in this century. It'll get scarce, it'll get pricey. But if we burn it all, we go up and up. We end up emitting 4 or more trillion pounds of carbon dioxide in the next 80 years. We end up at 1,000 parts per million. To get anywhere lower than that, 750 parts per million, 450, we have to start cutting down on fossil fuels. And nothing else will do. The good news is that this can be done. The bad news is that, we don't do it by buying a greener brand of toilet paper or by sorting our waste a little better. I'm sorry, we do it by fixing the cars and the plumbing in the houses. And unfortunately, we also have to do it by saying no to the biggest, richest, and most powerful industry in the world, which has some levers and hooks that they will use in return. But anyway, if we want anything less than 1,000 parts per million, we have to act, and the sooner we act, the easier it is. We basically have to say no to fossil fuels. Where does science think we should stay? Science is just a lot of scientists. They don't know, but the prevailing wisdom is we're already past where we should have stayed. So we'll take anything we can get, as low as we can get, but we're already past safety. Safety is not some point ahead of us where we stop the car, but safety is a point that we've already passed. Climate science, Adirondacks. What do those kind of numbers I just showed you mean for the Adirondacks? Well, there are those numbers, there are some ranges of uncertainty, but what they mean, as what they mean for the planet, is that the weather gets warmer, the weather gets wetter, the weather gets more violent and less predictable. And part of it can be visualized by taking the Adirondack Park and moving it southwards. Part of it can't be visualized because that doesn't capture the less predictable and violent part. West Virginia is not a particularly violent or unpredictable weather. And we're heading, and I keep using those words to drum them into you, we're heading for violence and unpredictability. I asked the best farmer I know, whose farm feeds about 300 families year-round, and who's farming all his adult life, I said, Matt, you know, farming all over the country, you watch the weather. When you look ahead for the next 10 years, what do you say? See, and he said, chaos, Jerry, chaos. So what we are seeing is, on a burn-it-all scenario, we're seeing Adirondacks with the temperatures somewhere around the Gulf coastal plain. We are seeing our best, an almost impossibly optimistic scenario of immediate world action, temperatures of West Virginia. We're seeing in Adirondacks, under realistic scenarios, even with all of our action, with southern Appalachian-like climates, but more violent and less predictable. So just a little bit about the Adirondacks. What I'm going to talk about for a slide or two here is vulnerability. So here we are over the Adirondacks, a big, beautiful, we're flying in Ed McNeil's open plane that he has built for conservation videography. A big forested landscape. These are northern forests. Once in a while you see an oak, but most of these trees, most of the deciduous trees barely live, south of New York City. They go down the mountains a little bit. The conifers barely live south of here. We are not only a temperate forest, the temperate forests of the world have been pretty fragmented and cut down. Those are the areas, they once covered all of Europe. We're in one of the big belts of temperate forests, and I would argue that the Adirondacks are one of the, I can't say about the world, but certainly in North America, one of the biggest and most intact, least logged chunks. Wonderful old growth, big trees in it. These trees have been around for hundreds of years. We have 250,000 acres with these kind of trees. These are not trees that are happy in North Carolina, I'm afraid. But not only that, we have a whole batch of components that I call boreal, meaning northern. Boreas was the north wind. We have embedded in our deciduous forests, we have landscapes that are like the landscapes of Labrador or Ontario or northern Scandinavia. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful places. So these are the big bogs, the big open wetlands. We're still in the airplane by the way, we fly low when we film. And then we have these wonderful open river corridors, places where just for some reason or another, shrubs rule and the trees are just stopped there like a wall. I've been trying for 20 years to figure out why the trees stop like a wall there, and I really can't. And then, of course, we have boreal creatures. Here's the gray jay. And we have a number of these creatures, plants and animals and birds, whose range is all across the north. Creatures of the north, just like cross-country skiers and hockey players and so on, and for whom we're the southernmost place where they come, which is to say front lines of climate change here. And one of the things I study, and I've been just sort of working out how these things are arranged, because of course they're not just here, but that would be one of those bogs on the shore of a river. They're fitted into fairly complicated patterns. There's ecology, there is interrelatedness. All of this is a balance created by many, many, many centuries of climate stability. We don't have climate stability anymore. So we have many creatures. These are the northernmost birds in the lowland boreal. Many plants, and again, just skipping back fast, these giant landscapes, all very much at risk. So I would say we have an ecology to fight for. It's going to be a hard fight, very much at risk from climate change. But we also have an adversary of great power, because in the 25 years since I began to think about this, the whole planet has changed. When I began to think about this in the 1980s, the scientific opinion was that the science is right, but we cannot detect it yet. By 1998, 2000, we could detect it, but we could only detect it as an overall warming of the planet. But we couldn't really say the weather has changed. But just in 10 years past that, everywhere we look around the planet, we find radical change. And this is the second idea that's really important in this talk, and I'm going to take a moment or two at it. There are two kinds of change there. There's change in black and there's change in red. And the change in black are direct effects of heat. You make it hotter, and I'll be back to this slide in a moment, but you make it hotter and the Arctic sea ice just melts like that, 1981, 2011. If you want to ask who is a big climate believer these days, the answer, interestingly enough, is ExxonMobil. Now, it's true that they spend $1 million or $2 million a year funding people to say climate change is not real, but they are spending billions in a project with the Russians to start exploring for oil off the Russian North Slope in that open channel off to the right there. That billions and billions of dollar project is only viable if climate change is real, by the way. So they hire first-rate scientists to tell them it's real and plan and bet their company on it. They hire third-rate scientists to try to convince us that it's not real. We're not that stupid, thank you. I'll be back to these things. But so those are direct things. The other things in red, like increases in forest fires and drought, more intense tropical storms, extended droughts, more violent monsoons, those are indirect effects. And one has to be a little clear, and let's just take an example. All over at least the northern hemisphere in the last 20 years, the amount of rainfall in particularly intense storms, the intensity of rainstorms, has been increasing. And it is now possible, people say, the first thing they said after Hurricane Katrina was, you cannot attribute one storm to climate change. Well, it turns out 5-8 years later that the calculations have been done and we can. It's not been done with Katrina. It took half the scientific computers in Britain to do it for an enormous British flood and storm in 2003, and they just did the calculations a year ago. But they did. They said there was an 80 to 90% chance that this storm would not have happened if carbon dioxide had been what it was back 100 years ago. So the fact is, yes, we can do that attribution. And we can say with some certainty that the increase in violent rainstorms and heavy rains is due to climate change and would not have happened if carbon dioxide was what it used to be. How do scientists do that? 3 arguments. And just very quickly, one is that it's exactly what's predicted. You warm the earth, the weather gets wetter, there's more water in the atmosphere, but there's also more violent circulation, so it comes down faster. And curiously enough, the same things that make it wetter some places make it drier other places. The second argument is that it's simply happening all over. You're seeing this in all parts of the northern hemisphere. And the third argument is that this is outlandish based on the statistics of what one expected. There is no other possible cause for this. And I'll just take one more minute with this argument. We have a professional ball player. He's hit 20 home runs a year for years. He's a good hitter. All of a sudden, he takes steroids, he bulks up, he is hitting 80 home runs a year. He is the best in the world. Can we say when he hits one home run that it's the result of the steroids he took? And one is tempted to say, well, no, because he hit home runs 5 years ago before he took all those steroids. But think about it. He's hitting 4 times as many, so at least 3 out of every 4 home runs he hits, he would not have hit if he hadn't taken the steroids. So the argument becomes, okay, well, maybe 1 home run, 2 home runs, that's not the effect of steroids, but 80 in a season, you bet. And that's the exact argument that the climate people are making now, which is to say that we are seeing too much of this outlandish weather, too much fire, too much drought, too much intense monsoon, too much flooding. Okay, I'll be back to the Adirondacks in a second, but I just wanted to persuade you a little bit that these changes, or just show you, I don't have to persuade you, that these changes are worldwide and that we're seeing them almost every place we look. So here was the melting, 20-year melting, 30-year melting of the Arctic ice cap at its lowest extent. Here is the maximum extent of Arctic ice in 2 months. And you can see it's going down, but even after 2000, things, and that's when climate change really became detectable, it has picked up. And here's another Arctic change. The color gives you the number of days relative to the old average, a truly outlandish, unexpected melting of the surface of Greenland. And I want to remember, well, yeah, ice is interesting, but ice has consequences. And I just made this graph from a paper, and it's a jumble. And I apologize, but you're looking at the surface of the world. You're looking at all the caribou and the reindeer herds in the world. Next to musk oxen, the biggest herbivore in the Arctic, and also a source animal for many native economies up there. The reindeer herds in red have all declined within the last 20, 30 years. And those graphs just show some of the declines. Many of those declines are fairly recent ones, last 20 or 30 years. The reindeer herds in green are the ones that have increased. The brown we just don't have data on. So as the whole Arctic changes, you also have a global change in ecology. And for biologists, these are very worrying. For climatologists, these are very worrying too, because the Arctic contains a carbon bomb. Several other places like the Amazon do too, but the Arctic contains an enormous amount of surface carbon in undecayed vegetation, peat. And one of the great fears is that we get warm and we're getting near a tipping point when that carbon starts to release itself. So it's sort of like an oil well gushing and burning, but a natural fire, and one that we will not be able to stop. A little bit of Adirondack news. Just what's happening around here. So some graphs fast, but we have seen a general warming over the last century with a little dip, but we have seen a real serious warming in the last 30 years. We have seen in the last 40 or so, not so much changes in total amount of snow, but big decreases all over the Northeast in the number of days snow stays on the ground. We have seen an increase up north here in the last 20 or 30 years in total participation. But that right-hand graph, and that's just a fly-speck mess of plots, but when you pull a tendency out of that, those are the violent storms, the particularly heavy storms, and they're now a third to half again as many violent storms as there were. And that's because violent storms are what do the damage. That's an ominous trait. What's happening as a result of this is that we are seeing biological change, but we're not seeing very much. It may be because we're not looking hard enough. It's very hard to get biologists out in the field, to keep them fed, to keep them working. There's an awful lot of stuff we should be looking at that we're not. But nonetheless, over the last century, these are northern range expansions of birds. We've been seeing all kinds of northern movement in birds, and so those are southern birds coming north. Have we been losing the northern birds? Well, my colleague Michaeli Glennon has been working on some of these boreal birds, and it's up here in the Adirondacks. It's a very mixed picture. This is just 4 years of data. Some of them are increasing, some of them have very little change, but some of the significant ones are decreasing. And all of those decreasers are also showing decreases over their North American range. So there may be a biological signal. Now, if you had asked me 4 months ago whether I thought climate change was going to hit the Adirondacks hard in the next year or 5 years, I would have said no. You know, it's going to be gradual. But 10 years, 20 years, it may hit us hard. And if you'd asked me, is it going to hit human communities first? or is it going to hit natural communities first? I would have said natural communities. They're the vulnerable ones. Well, as of August 28th, I had to change all of my thinking because one, quote, freak storm comes, and in 10 hours at night, it knocks out the whole transportation system of Vermont, by the way. Every major road and many of the minor roads was cut. You could not go 20 miles in any direction, almost any place in Vermont. It takes hundreds of houses away. It causes millions of dollars of damage to both private people, to farms, to businesses, and then to the highways in little communities. Fortunately, it takes few lives, but it did take 5 or 6 when we totaled them. Here's the White River over in Vermont, and it just built new channels. And so then the question is, what do you do? And they're actually trying to, that whole width is where the river rampaged. They're sort of trying to build the river a new channel, and they've got this totally Don Quixote idea that they're going to keep it in that new channel. Ha. But anyway, we have already taken a climate blow. And remember that this year, and I'll do the count, remember that this year alone, violent tornadoes in the spring, but they may not be tied to climate change. There is no evidence. Unprecedented drought, Texas, Oklahoma, 200, 250 days without rain now. Worst ever, tied to climate change. Unprecedented floods in the whole Mississippi River system. Unprecedented drought in the Pacific Northwest of Canada and bad forest fires. Unprecedented flooding in the, you're getting tired of that word, but I'm rubbing it in the Champlain Basin, major crop losses, the lake stays high. And then just come to the fall, here's Hurricane Irene. 7 days later, Binghamton has a 1,000-year storm that's an independent storm from a different weather system. And then 10 days ago, southern New York has 1.5 feet of snow, the heaviest, just about the heaviest ever October storm, power out to 1 million plus customers. And so if you ask me, and you know I can't show you calculations, could we have had a year like this if carbon dioxide was at 180 parts per million, what it was when my parents were kids? I simply have to answer, no way. How likely is it? You know, we can't say that Hurricane Irene was caused by climate change. If carbon dioxide was back where it was, is it very likely that that storm would have been as intense as it was? And my answer is no. I'm going to finish just with a tiny, just 3 pictures of framework for you all are thinking about what we can do locally, what you can do in a school or a home. And you have the whole rest of the conference, and you've already gone miles thinking about what to do. So I'm not going to tell you that, but I am going to give you just 2 principles or so here. And one is that, you know, when you start to think about changing the energy in a school or a home or whatever, there are easy things, and there are things that have immediate payoffs, and then there are hard things. And the principles are so simple, but you do the easy things first, but then you want to do the hard things. And here's the real trick. The easy things have to be made to pay for the hard things, because there's a lot of easy money to be made by purchasing less, by making things more efficient, by just simply using less. That's thrift. But then you're going to have to sooner or later generate energy. And the real eventual test of a carbon-reducing program is not just how thrifty it is, but where it gets the energy from. And you're going to need the renewables to work for you, and they're going to cost more. So if thrift just pays, you know, for you to buy more sneakers from China, thrift hasn't accomplished anything. If thrift pays for your renewables, and then if you use the passive renewables, the cheap ones first, and then go to the fancy stuff, and eventually we all have to go to the fancy stuff. But if you do the thrift first, and then it becomes part of a long-range program that then, you know, in schools, the hard the impossibly hard nut is going to be transportation, but it can be done. There will be electric buses, but it's going to take building up investment and capital, and the other things have to yield that capital. I want to stop talking. I just want you to note that there's a loaf of bread there. I don't have very good numbers, but I am becoming more and more convinced that one of the major carbon flows, one of the major ways we subsidize other people to emit carbon for us is by buying food at the national scale, and one of the ways we really cut our emissions is by buying it locally. I thought I would, having given you a grim lecture, conclude with an extraordinarily hopeful diagram. Those are the costs. That's just like watching the cost for memory and computers go down in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. That's an amazing curve. That's a 6-7% a year curve. And where it is heading with solar panels is to a place where we'll be able to use them in ways that I couldn't even dream of 5 years ago. So I've rambled a little bit at the end, and I'm done. There is a journey. The water is rough. We're all going to take it. It's going to be enormously difficult. My parents grew up of age where they had to go overseas and fly bombers and man ships because the world was at risk. They had a terrible, exciting time that they never forgot the rest of their lives. We have, for the rest of our lives, long or short, a very, very challenging world. We have to transform it. It's going to be enormously exciting to do that. Thank you.